Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on the north bank of the Thames. The year is 878 AD. The river moves the same way it always has, wide, gray, indifferent. The smell hits you first, mud and salt and rotting wood. There are birds, there is wind, but there is almost no sound of human activity. No carts, no market calls, no construction. Where London once stood, where the Romans built a basilica large enough to rival anything in the western provinces, where a forum spread across several acres, where a stone bridge crossed the Thames and tens of thousands of people once moved through ordered streets, there is, in 878 AD, almost nothing functioning. The Roman city, Londinium, has been abandoned as an inhabited urban center for roughly 4 centuries. Its walls still stand, cracked and patched in places, grown over with vegetation. Inside those walls, scattered occupation, some reuse of Roman structures, evidence of activity, but not a city in any meaningful sense. To the west of the Roman walls, along the riverbank between what is now the Strand and the river, lies a settlement the Anglo-Saxons called Londonwick. This is where most of the actual population has been living for the past 2 centuries. Outside the old Roman walls, in a trading settlement without proper defenses, clustered around the river trade. Archaeological excavations from the 20th century, particularly the work done beneath Covent Garden and along the Strand, have confirmed that Londonwick was a genuine and active Middle Saxon trading port, an emporium, as historians call it, with evidence of metalworking, textile production, and long-distance commerce reaching as far as the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel. But in 878 AD, Londonwick is not in good shape either. The Vikings have arrived, not as a sudden shock. They have been raiding, wintering, and seizing territory across England for decades by this point. In 865 AD, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia and began a systematic military campaign that, within a decade, brought down the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, devastated Mercia, and very nearly destroyed Wessex itself. Londonwick had been attacked and partially destroyed in the 840s. The Thames was a highway for Viking longships. The open, undefended riverside settlement was precisely the kind of target that a Norse raiding force could strike, loot, and leave in hours. By the time Alfred, King of Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom still resisting, survives the crisis winter of 878 and begins rebuilding, London and the surrounding region are under the practical control of the Danes. Alfred's victory at Edington in 878 forces a negotiated peace with Guthrum, the Danish leader, but the situation remains fragile. The treaty that follows, the Peace of Wedmore, and the later boundary agreement encoded in what historians call the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, divides England roughly along a diagonal line. The Danelaw occupies the north and east. Alfred holds Wessex and gradually begins reasserting influence over Mercia. London sits right on the edge of this contested boundary. This is the context in which Alfred's decision about London must be understood. It is not a story about a king who loved cities or held a romantic attachment to the memory of Rome. It is a story about military strategy, political consolidation, and the realization, practical and hard-won, that defending a population requires giving that population somewhere defensible to live. Alfred's approach to this problem was systematic in a way that has no real parallel in early medieval England. He developed over the course of the 880s and 890s a network of fortified settlements across Wessex and English Mercia that historians now refer to as burhs. These were not simply military forts. They were planned, populated, economically functional urban centers, or were intended to become so. We know the system in considerable detail because of a remarkable document that survives from this period, the Burgel Hidage. And the Burgel Hidage lists 33 fortified places and assigns to each a specific number of hides, the Anglo-Saxon unit of land assessment, from which the garrison and maintenance of the burh's walls were to be funded. The document encodes a formula. 1 hide was expected to support the defense of 1 pole of wall, roughly 5 meters. From this formula, historians have been able to calculate the intended wall length of each burh, and in most cases those calculations correspond closely with what survives archaeologically on the ground. The system was not improvised. It was a coordinated, empire-level administrative response to the problem of Viking mobility. The Vikings moved fast, by river and sea, and could strike before a distant army could respond. One, the burhs were designed so that no settlement in Wessex would be more than a day's march from a fortified refuge. They were spaced, positioned, and provisioned with this logic in mind. London was different from most burhs in one crucial respect. It already existed, or rather, the bones of it already existed, in the form of Rome's abandoned infrastructure. When Alfred moved to bring London back under English control, which he did in 886 AD, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he was making a decision that was simultaneously military, political, and urban in its implications. The Chronicle records that Alfred restored London. The Old English verb used is gehalgod, which carries a sense of consecration or formal re-establishment, and that he entrusted the city to his son-in-law Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians. This was a significant political act. By placing London under mercy and authority while retaining ultimate Alfredian overlordship, Alfred was managing the complex dual loyalty of a city that sat on the boundary between his own kingdom and his Mercian ally. But what did the restoration of London actually mean in practice? The answer begins with a decision about where exactly the population should live. This is not an obvious question, and its resolution represents one of the most consequential urban planning choices made anywhere in early medieval Europe. Lundenwic, the existing Middle Saxon trading settlement along the Strand, had been the functional center of activity for roughly 2 centuries. It had infrastructure of a sort. It had residents, traders, and commercial networks. Moving away from it meant abandoning the accumulated economic and social fabric of that settlement. But Lundenwic had a fatal vulnerability. It was open. It sat outside the old Roman walls and had no serious defensive perimeter. Against Viking raiders operating from the river, it offered almost no protection. The 840s raid had demonstrated this conclusively. The Roman walls, by contrast, still stood. They enclosed a circuit of roughly 3 kilometers, protecting the elevated ground of the city, the area we still refer to today as the Square Mile. Inside those walls lay the ruins of Roman Londinium, the footprint of the Forum, the remnants of the Basilica, the foundations of the governor's palace, the lines of Roman streets that had not entirely vanished. The walls themselves were not in perfect condition, but they were substantial, built of Kentish ragstone, reinforced at intervals, still standing to several meters in many sections. Alfred's decision, enacted through Ethelred and documented in surviving land charters from the late 880s and 890s, was to shift the population inside the Roman walls and to create a new street grid designed for the needs of a living Anglo-Saxon city. The charters, several do survive, albeit not without interpretive complexities. Record grants of land within the city, the establishment of haga, which were private urban properties tied to specific lords or institutions, and references to streets and landmarks that allow archaeologists to begin reconstructing the layout. The work of researchers including Martin Biddle, who pioneered the study of Winchester's burh layout, and the London-specific scholarship produced from the Museum of London Archaeology and the broader Cheapside project has established that Alfred's London involved a deliberate street planning program. The east-west street of Cheapside, the network of lanes running down to the Thames waterfront, the positioning of the Queenhithe Harbour, these are not random accumulations. They reflect a planned approach to organizing commercial movement, river access, and defensive depth within the walled circuit. Queenhithe deserves specific attention. This inlet on the Thames waterfront, which still bears its name today, you can stand on the embankment near the Millennium Bridge and see the location, was developed under Alfred as a controlled harbor facility. The name itself preserves the memory. Hythe is an Old English word for a landing place or harbor. A charter survives, now known as the Queenhithe Charter, which grants the use of this harbor to the Archbishop of Canterbury with specific conditions attached. This document is important not just as evidence of the harbor's existence, but as evidence of the administrative machinery being applied to London's development. Alfred and Ethelred were not simply walling a city and hoping for the best. They were actively managing its commercial infrastructure. The population that moved into the new London burh, the fortified London, came from Lundenwic. The old trading settlement along the Strand did not disappear overnight. Archaeological evidence suggests a gradual transition across the 880s and 890s, with activity declining in Londonwick while increasing inside the walls. Some continuity of use in Londonwick is suggested by finds, but the commercial and residential center of gravity shifted east into the Roman circuit. For the people who made this move, the transition was not straightforward. The Roman city they were entering was not a functioning urban landscape. It was, in significant parts, a landscape of ruins. The Great Basilica, once the largest building north of the Alps, stretching over 160 meters in length, had been collapsing incrementally for centuries. Parts of its walls and foundations remained. The Forum, the open public space at the city's heart, had not functioned as a civic center for generations. Roman street lines survived in places, but the built environment had been substantially dismantled, robbed of stone, high and reclaimed by vegetation. Moving into this environment required not just courage but practical adaptation. Anglo-Saxon Londoners built in timber, where Romans had built in stone. They sunk their wells, dug their cesspits, and laid their floors over Roman rubble. The archaeology of this period in London, recovered in fragments across centuries of later development, shows the overlay of these two civilizations at a material level. Roman tile reused in Anglo-Saxon foundations. Roman wall lines respected and partially incorporated into new property boundaries. The new street grid aligned not always with Roman streets, but with the logic of movement the Roman topography imposed. Who was Alfred during all of this? It is worth pausing here, because Alfred has attracted such an accumulation of legend and retrospective admiration that separating the documented individual from the mythology requires care. What we know, Alfred was born around 849 AD, the youngest of 5 sons of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. He traveled to Rome twice as a child, once at around age 4 and once at around age 5, accompanying his father, which exposed him early to both the prestige of the papacy and presumably to the monumental scale of a city that was, even in its reduced state, unlike anything in England. He inherited the Wessex kingship in 871 under conditions of severe military pressure. And his reign of the late 870s included a period of genuine crisis. The flight to the Somerset marshes at Athelney in the winter of 878 is documented in sources and is not mythological in its basic outline, even if the famous story of the burned cakes almost certainly is. Alfred was literate in a period when literacy among secular rulers was unusual. He translated Latin texts into Old English, established a court school, and wrote, or caused to be written, documents of administrative and legal significance. The laws he issued, the Dooms, represent a systematic attempt to codify legal practice across his kingdom. His engagement with the written word was not merely personal, it was part of a program of governance. This matters for London because the documentary evidence we have, the charters, the administrative grants, the Burgle Heitage reflects a system of government that was capable of planning at scale. Alfred did not rebuild London by wandering through it with good intentions. He rebuilt it through a structure of lords, agents, legal instruments, and administrative records. The military logic behind London's restoration extended beyond the walls themselves. A fortified city is only as useful as its ability to sustain a garrison and a population under pressure. This requires food supply, water, and, critically, economic activity sufficient to support permanent settlement. Alfred and Ethelred's administration addressed this through the grant system and through the deliberate encouragement of trade. The Haga, the urban landholdings granted to bishops, abbots, and lay lords, were not charity. They came with obligations. The holders of these properties were expected to contribute to the maintenance of the walls and to the garrisoning of the city. This is the same logic encoded in the Burgle Heitage applied to an urban context. The city was structured so that its own prosperity would fund its own defense. Coin evidence supports the picture of a commercially reviving London in Alfred's reign. A distinctive coinage associated with Alfred and with London, including the celebrated Two Emperors penny, which depicts Alfred and Ceolwulf II of Mercia facing each other in the manner of Roman emperors, reflects both the political relationship between Wessex and Mercia and the importance of London as a mint site. Control of coinage was control of commerce, and the re-establishment of minting at London was not incidental. It was a statement about what London was intended to become. The population of Alfred's London is genuinely uncertain. We should be careful not to project false precision onto a period with limited demographic evidence. What we can say is that by the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the pattern of land grants, the evidence of craft activity, and the later documentation of markets and parish churches within the walls all suggest a functioning, growing urban community. The transition from the scattered occupation of the post-Roman period to a recognizable town was underway. It was also not yet complete. The London that Alfred built was a beginning, not an endpoint. The city he restored would need further development across the reigns of his children and grandchildren. Edward the Elder, Ethelfled, won Ethelstan before it became the commercial and political center that later medieval England would recognize. The street names that Londoners still use today, Cheapside from the Old English seep, meaning trade or market, Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Cripplegate, naming the Roman and Alfredian gates of the walls, are the fossilized vocabulary of the city Alfred and Ethelred designed. The property boundaries of the square mile follow, in places with remarkable fidelity, the land divisions established in the 9th and 10th centuries. When you walk through the city of London today, you are walking through a landscape whose bones were laid in response to a Viking threat that materialized over 1100 years ago. Outside the walls, the old London wick continued to thin out and eventually to transform. The area we now know as the Strand and Covent Garden retained traces of activity, but its function as the primary settlement of the region ended with the Alfredian reorganization. The name Aldwych, still visible on London maps today at the eastern end of the Strand, is thought to derive from Eldwick, meaning the old settlement or old trading place. If this etymology is correct, and most scholars find it plausible, then Londoners of the 10th and 11th centuries were already looking back at the abandoned Lundenwijk as something historical, a place that had been, rather than a place that was. This is one of the quieter revelations of Alfred's London. It produced its own history almost immediately. A city whose population had moved, whose street grid was new, whose harbor had been formally re-established by charter. She was already by the 10th century layered with memory. The walls were Roman, the streets were Alfredian, the churches that began filling the city grid, the small timber-built parish churches that would eventually number over 100 within the walls, were Saxon and then Norman. Each layer was a response to specific pressures, specific decisions, specific individuals whose names we sometimes know and often do not. Alfred died in 899 AD. He did not see London become the capital of England. That process unfolded across generations, and London's primacy was not a foregone conclusion even in the 10th century. Winchester, Alfred's own royal center, remained the administrative heart of the West Saxon kingdom. But the groundwork Alfred and Ethelred laid in London, the walls, the street grid, the harbor, the commercial framework, yes, the legal instruments, gave the city the infrastructure it needed to grow. It is worth dwelling briefly on what Alfred could not control, the unpredictability of what came after. His careful system of burghs, his administrative charters, his mint, all of these were rational responses to the conditions of the 880s. But cities are not machines that run according to the intentions of their planners. The people who moved into London Borough brought their own networks, their own disputes, their own trade connections and family alliances. The Danes who remained in and around the region, for the Danelaw was never a rigid boundary, and trade across it continued throughout Alfred's reign, contributed to London's commercial culture in ways that were not purely adversarial. Viking Age London was not ethnically or culturally sealed. The archaeological record captures this complexity better than any chronicle can. Scandinavian-style metalwork found in 9th and 10th century London contexts, imported Frankish pottery, evidence of long-distance trade in goods from the Baltic and the Mediterranean. A city being deliberately rebuilt from Roman ruins was simultaneously a node in trade networks that stretched across half the known world. What Alfred gambled on, and the word gamble is not inappropriate, given how uncertain the outcome must have seemed in 886, was that the investment of administrative energy and political capital into London's restoration would pay returns in military security and economic strength. By most measures, within his own lifetime, and certainly within a generation of his death, it did. The London of 900 AD was not a great city by the standards of Constantinople or Cordoba. It was a town of perhaps a few thousand people, still building within the shadows of Roman walls it had not built and did not fully understand. But it was functioning. It was defensible, it was organized, and it was growing. That in the context of 9th century England was extraordinary. There is a temptation, when discussing Alfred, to let admiration slide into mythology. The Victorian age did exactly this, constructing a figure of almost saintly perfection from a king whose actual record, while impressive, was also marked by the brutal realities of early medieval rulership. Alfred enslaved people. His legal codes prescribed harsh physical punishments. His military campaigns involved the devastation of territories. The world he operated in was not gentler for his presence in it, but what makes the urban history of Alfred's London genuinely significant is precisely that it was not mythological in its mechanisms. It was administrative, it was documented, it was planned. In a period when most of Western Europe lacked the institutional capacity to organize sustained urban development, Alfred's Wessex produced a system. The Burr Network, the Burgle Hidage, the Land Charter Framework, the Mint, that translated a military necessity into an enduring urban reality. Compare this to what was happening elsewhere in Europe at roughly the same moment. In 886 AD, the year Alfred restored London, the Carolingian Empire that Charlemagne had assembled was in accelerating fragmentation. Viking forces were besieging Paris, which the cities of the former Western Roman Empire, Rome itself, Ravenna, Trier, Milan, were either in decline, fighting for survival, or managing painful contractions from their ancient scale. Urban life in the West was not gone, but it was under genuine pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. London's restoration sits within this broader context as something unusual, a deliberate act of urban refoundation, informed by Roman precedent, executed through Anglo-Saxon administrative methods, in response to a specific and immediate military threat. It was not nostalgic. Alfred was not trying to rebuild the Roman city. He was using the Roman infrastructure, primarily the walls, but also the street patterns where they were useful, as raw material for something new. And the people who lived through this transition left almost no personal testimony. We do not have the voices of the traders who abandoned their workshops in Londonwick and moved into the walled city. We do not have the accounts of the laborers who repaired the Roman walls, or the craftsmen who built the first timber halls inside them, or the women who kept households functioning in the rubble of an ancient civilization. The documentary record skews heavily toward kings, bishops, and institutional landholders. The archaeology recovers objects but not voices. What we have, assembled from these partial sources, is a picture of a decision that worked. London did not fall to the Vikings. It did not empty out again after Alfred's death. Is the Alfredian framework proved durable enough to absorb the upheavals of the 10th century? The reconquest of the Danelaw under Edward and Ethelflad, the Danish incursions of Ethelred the Unready's reign, the eventual conquest of England by Knut in 1016. Each of these crises stressed the city, but none dismantled the urban structure Alfred had established. When William the Conqueror arrived in 1066, he found in London a city substantial enough that he could not simply ignore it. His immediate construction of the Tower of London, begun almost certainly within the first years after Hastings, was, among other things, an acknowledgement that London was too important and too populated to be left uncontrolled. The city that William needed to dominate was the city Alfred had built. Stand today at the corner of Cheapside and Bread Street in the city of London. The Roman street grid is gone. The Alfredian timber buildings are gone. The medieval church of St. Mary Le Bow, rebuilt by Wren after the Great Fire, stands where earlier foundations ran. The street names compress centuries of history into syllables that most people pass without thinking about. But the layout of the street, the east-west orientation of Cheapside, the lanes running toward the river, the position of the old city gates encoded in Aldgate and Bishopsgate and Ludgate Hill. These follow a plan that was deliberate, that was made by identifiable people in a specific political crisis, and that has proven durable beyond any reasonable expectation. Alfred of Wessex did not know that London would become one of the largest cities in the world. When he was solving a problem, how to defend a population against an enemy with superior mobility, the city he built to solve that problem is still, in its deep structure, the city that stands today. That is what it means to reshape urban history. Not grand vision, not romantic ambition, a practical decision made under pressure that outlasted the pressure by more than 1,000 years.